Hello and welcome to the pod. I'm Nathan Fink.
I'm Jolyn Drennan, and this is New Hampshire Family Now,
a show about building family in the Granite State. Today in the show, Dr. Loretta L.C. Brady joins us to discuss her new book, Technology Touchpoints, and shows me where the pantry is. New Hampshire Family Now is brought to you by the New Hampshire Charitable Foundation. Since 1962, the Charitable Foundation has worked hand in hand with generous and visionary citizens to maximize the power of giving and support, collaborate, and lead innovative initiatives. Initiatives like New Hampshire Tomorrow, which is focused on making sure children and families have access to education, healthcare, and career pathways to ensure every family member thrives. To learn more about New Hampshire Charitable Foundation and all their initiatives, go to www.nhcf.org. This podcast was also brought to you by Family Support New Hampshire. Family Support New Hampshire is NH's coalition of family resource centers and family strengthening programs that exist to ensure Granite State families have access to resources so both caregivers and children can succeed, because supported families are strong families. To find a family resource center near you, visit www.fsnh.org. Hey, it's Nathan, co-host of New Hampshire Family Now. I wanted to take a quick break from the show because it occurred to me the other day that I've never asked you to subscribe to this podcast. Subscribing is free, and when you do it, it helps our placement algorithms, making it that much easier for caregivers across New Hampshire to find valuable information and strategies for their families. Also, you'll be alerted when a new episode drops. And if you like the show, leaving a review helps us that much more. So go to wherever you get your podcast, type in New Hampshire Family Now, and as the kids say, smash that subscribe button. I say click it, because if you smash it, then you're going to need a new one. Thank you and enjoy today's podcast. Hello and welcome to the podcast. Today on the show, I have the pleasure to once again welcome Dr. Loretta L.C. Brady, professor of psychology at St. Anselm College, director at the Community Resilience and Social Equity Lab, and author of the recently released Technology Touchpoints, Parenting in a Digital Dystopia. Dr. Brady, welcome back.
Thank you so much for having me back. It's really an honor.
So good to see you. The holidays season is upon us. How are you doing with that? Are you hanging in there? Are you hosting? What's going on?
Yeah, my strategy this year, have a really low bar and be done early. And then whatever happens after that's cool. No expectations.
There must be a point where with that lowering of the bar where you just put an arrow at the pantry, serve yourself.
That might just be our everyday functioning, right? At this point, everyone can prepare themselves something. And
yep. Well, I'm so glad you're here. I am deep into your new book, Technology Touchpoints.
Yeah.
In the beginning, you say, well, this is a story about a family. It's really a story about global actors, policymakers, and the tech industry. Obviously, I'm paraphrasing, and those impacts that I think are unfolding right in front of us. And obviously, I have a family, you have a family. And so first and foremost, I just want to let you know it's beautifully written. It really does read like a story. Also, though, I want to know, it seems to have become important to you to weave your family's story into this fabric. I'm so curious about that choice.
I guess it felt necessary, but I think for me, it just felt like reality. It felt as though, because of the work that I do, because of the work that my husband has done, I say in the book, we've always been early adopters of technology because of my husband. My husband's been in the tech industry since the late 80s, essentially early 90s. He's seen all of the boom and bust cycles of the tech and telecom industries that have happened since then. And the work that I do as a professor and teaching organizational psychology, and then also working in a variety of areas around organizational development, has brought us both face to face with many of these actors, many of these forces. And it's really impossible not to kind of recognize the patterns when you're that close to some of these business cycles and innovation cycles and then government policy cycles. And, I wanted to focus on the family story because I feel like that was grounding and that was relatable. And I felt it was really important to be able to use that to point to these other forces that are often invisible and very rarely discussed when we talk about parenting and technology, or we talk about, youth and social media. Sometimes we have policy and federal regulation discussions about those things, but very, very rarely, and usually only after some, major incident has occurred, whether it's, the release of 60,000 documents from a certain company or, other kinds of unfortunate incidents. So for me, it felt like, our family had seen good and bad, and not in the extremes, not in sort of Senate testimony level types of events, but I was seeing an impact between my children, with ourselves. And it felt important that not be presented as though it was just a family story, because I don't believe it is.
No, I totally agree. And I think that there's this tendency in us following massive events where we can point at it. And what happens there is, because we're trying to figure out how to just return to our normal lives, we get in this blame cycle, and that blame cycle lands on the parents, right? It's your usage. It's your invitation to this technology that has caused whatever it is we're trying to avoid. And yet, when I read your book, I have to say, I felt this great deal of relief, because it gave me a level of flexibility. And I think maybe my identification was there. I'm like, oh, you have kids. I have kids. It's everywhere, this thing we call tech. And yet my response as an adult still comes down to maybe what I'm being sold, which is this responsibility factor, this black-white thing. And then I'm a child of the 80s, so I say, well, I know life before this invasive tech. I know life after. And so I become black and white. Either I throw my hands up and I say, nothing can be done. It's pervasive. Or I want to fight it tooth and nail. And I'm like, go outside, turn it off. And I get really draconian about it. Why is that an innate response in us? And what can we do about it to soften and give ourselves a little bit of grace?
I think that as parents, we accept the responsibility of parenting and we take it seriously. And I think that's true of all parents, even parents who may not always be hitting the mark. I think all parents want to do well by their children and want the best for their children. They may not always have the best tools at their disposal to make that a reality, but I think that's a desire every parent has. So then that plays out with whatever forms of control and coercion and care we've been exposed to in our own earlier lives. And it's not unlike anyone who has some level of authority and has to be the decider of things, right? So you can think about managers when they were on the cusp of bring your device to work decisions and, how are they going to navigate that? Nope, can't bring it at all. Or, okay, it's open season, right? And I think that tendency to either do all or nothing is quite human. And of course, we're going to see that with our parenting. And of course, we're going to see that with technology. And that can be for a number of reasons. That can be cost, right? I mean, these are not inexpensive commitments that we would be making with a given purchase or with a subscription to some service. But, it can also be because of what you've described, a recognition of, my allowing this seems to fundamentally change an experience that I value. I got to have an experience of not feeling surveilled and not having everyone know my thought at any given moment and not being able to talk to friends for stretches of days over Thanksgiving holiday break. And those aren't experiences that my children will ever have. Unless there's a power outage or we are in a foreign country, those are just not things that are going to be their reality. They are going to be connected to people. And I don't know that it's wrong to go from one extreme to another. I think, there's one point I make in the book is that we are beta testers. No matter how advanced you believe the device or the platform or the technology is that you're taking on or that you're allowing your children to access or that they're just choosing for themselves, it's all in beta. It's always constantly in beta. And that means that we are the participants in the experiment of that particular thing. And when that's true, sometimes you have to have an all or nothing approach to things, or it's easy to understand how you develop that all or nothing approach to things because you just don't know what to rely on and what the implications of a given thing might be down the road.
It seems like we're always then in reflection mode, right?
Which is the most difficult mode to be.
We have, as adults, this capacity to be reflective. And I thought about this point in your book where you write about a presentation you had given, which then afterwards you were subject to some trolling, some hateful messages online, and some threats even. And there was a moment in there, and maybe I read into it more, that, as adults, we understand life before. And so the incredible nature of this technology, we can see its positives. And then we also experience its negatives. And that experience of its negatives may be different than the youth's experience of those negatives because we have had life without it. I guess the question I have here is I seem to be deducing this point that our youths might be better positioned than we think they are to sort through the noise of this pervasive technology. And so I want to ask you, how do you see our children's ability, given that they were born into it?
I don't know that that's universally true. I know that there are times for any given child, and there are some children for whom the exposure to negativity online and the exposure to, unrealistic things online is really harmful. And they don't have the life experience and they don't have the conversational space where that can get mediated with them. Right. So they absorb it, they digest it, and they do that in isolation, or they do that in the context of an online peer group that may or may not care at all about them as humans. So I want to be realistic about that that's real and that does happen and it does have effects. And we can talk about all sorts of studies to that end. And at the same time, for children where there is that conversational space, there's that real life space where they can bring and process and be overheard or share what is happening and what they're consuming. For those children, I do think that they are developing a skill around proximity and distance and the seriousness and impact the seriousness and sort of credit I should give this online interaction when compared to my in-person interactions. And that's what, made the pandemic so challenging, especially the lockdown period of the pandemic, is that access to the real in-person audience and experience was cut off and removed. And so, everything in the online space became the interaction arena. And that makes it much more challenging to appraise what's coming at you in an environment, whether that's online or in person, and give it that distance or that proximity rating that I think can help kind of turn the dial on what's being experienced. And in the book, the example I gave was overhearing my children kind of trash talk each other while playing a game. And, me in the context of this online trolling and feeling rather paralyzed on how to respond. And then hearing my children with their back and forth and realizing that my youngest child, who at that point was probably 5 or 6 years old, was giving it as well as she was getting it. I mean, she was keeping pace. She was, putting people into their place, holding her own. And yes, she was in a room of people who loved her. So obviously it's a very different experience than what I was subjected to. But I really did feel like there's something about that muscle that she's cultivating by being able to, decide whether she wants to respond. And then in her response, set something up and titrate how much of a takedown she wants to deliver. So I felt like those are useful skills. And maybe those are useful skills in a particularly online world where, things are going to come at you in these various settings online, and you won't do well if you've never cultivated the ability to either tune it out or respond directly or, use humor to deflect and, redirect someone's negative attention somewhere else. And you have to do that in life, in real, in person-to-person interactions. And it seems to me children would need to know how to do that in an online life as well.
And I think when I kind of catalog my fears, one of which is really my children's relationship with technology will actually replace relationships in real life, like in general, which, having read your book, that's not necessarily the case, that, these parasocial relationships, or friendships, I should say, have always been developing, and that these technologies may be reducing the distance between the child and those they idealize. And so I wanted to kind of focus in on that, because I see my son's parrot, hey, like and subscribe, smash the subscribe button. And I think it's so funny. First and foremost, what is a parasocial relationship, and how do you see these newer technologies affecting a child's development where relationships are concerned?
So parasocial relationships is an area of psychology study what looks at the relationships we have through media with figures. And those figures can be cartoon characters like Dora the Explorer. They can be, influencers like Kim Kardashian, right? Anything in between. So they can be real people. They can be artificial people. They can be cartoons. But the idea is that child forms an attachment with them. And maybe that attachment is enhanced because maybe there's physical products that are associated with that character or individual. So maybe I get a Dora Lovey, and I have Dora sheets, and I have a Dora, playset. And so all of these are ways that deepen that attachment and commitment I've made to this character. And pre-mobile screens, the research on this, and this comes out of a lab at Georgetown, Sandra Calvert's lab, I believe. Initially that research looked at, say, preschoolers and generalized that about 18 months is the length of a parasocial relationship, that about that time span, and then children start to shift, and it might be a few months in between, but usually by the time they're starting school, they've shifted into a new parasocial relationship. And again, that could be, having to watch a certain cartoon series every Saturday for us growing up, right? It could be playing a certain game, using a certain avatar, any number of ways of expressing that. With screens and with the types of gaming and other social platforms, one, we get more dose exposure to those figures if we want to. So it's not just, is it a physical item in my room, or is it on the family TV screen and I have access that way, but also all these other little bites, right? I can follow their profile, I can play with their avatar, etc. So that can heighten the connection, but it also seems in some research to be shortening the cycle of how long a figure is sort of dominant for a given child. I definitely feel that way as a middle-aged person watching the BMAs last night, or AMAs. I have no idea who some of those people were, but they did really well, so good for them. So in other words, when brands leverage that parasocial affiliation that even adults have, right? Adults have Disney tattoos, right? That's a parasocial relationship. But when brands leverage those, they kind of count on that being useful for them for a few business cycles. And in this environment, that may not be the case, right? So they're innovating their sort of positioning of figures and characters more quickly because the access and the intensity of that relationship is heightened. So the duration of that parasocial relationship tends to be shorter. I think one worry is that because of that shortened cycle, as parents, we are probably less familiar and appreciate less the particular trajectory of that figure and all the sources of influence that they pull from as they put together their content and push it out. And no one is, well, I won't say no one, but most people who are developing a platform for themselves and a following for themselves, they've got something to sell. And so what in a more produced experience that we were subjected to as we were growing up, whatever that message was that was being sold was carefully, packaged. And there were several meetings that had to be called before that was the approved strategy, rightly or wrong, right? There's lots of ways that approach also failed, especially when we look at representation. And so I think that's a worry, and the opportunity is that sense of representation, that sense of, everyone can be creative and everyone can have great ideas and everyone can share their dramatic interpretation of a story. And it doesn't have to, be people who only look a certain way or who deliver a certain message. And in that way, it can be really great. And then there's the algorithms that make it more or less likely that we'll see that great content that's really representative or creative or carrying a message that we want our children to see, right? More often it's going to be, oh, you like these 3 toy videos? Then we're going to give you more of that. And we might throw in a little hate clip here and there too, just because that's how our algorithm works. And
that's exactly right. You hesitate over something and the algorithm notes that. Well, we're going to take a quick break, but when we come back, we'll have more with Dr. Loretta Elsie Brady, author of Technology Touchpoints, Parenting in a Digital Dystopia. Don't go anywhere. Many thanks to New Hampshire's Office of Social and Emotional Wellness for sponsoring this podcast. Started within New Hampshire's Department of Education, the Office of Social and Emotional Wellness consolidates policy development and implements projects and programs that are focused on health and wellness with an emphasis on behavioral health of all students, youth, and families. To learn more about the Department of Education and its many programs and approaches, visit www.education.nh.gov. Today's show was also brought to you by the Children's Hospital at Dartmouth-Hitchcock and the Child Advocacy and Protection Program, a multidisciplinary program with the Children's Hospital established to evaluate and provide integrative care to suspected victims of child maltreatment. Together, a team of physicians, advanced practice registered nurses, social workers, nurses, and child life specialists work to provide consultation and evaluations of children who are suspected victims of abuse, so to serve in the best interest of children and families at multiple levels of prevention. For more information about Children's Hospital at Dartmouth-Hitchcock and the Child Advocacy Protection Program, visit www.chadkids.org/child-advocacy. And now back to our interview with Dr. Loretta Elsie Brady. And I think this kind of leads into my next question, because I want to talk a little bit about meme culture. There's this section in your book, and I think this is great. And I've been struggling with this personally because you've got the curation of these quick cultural moments, right? And it struck me that in my child rearing era, that I feel like I am floundering one meme to the next. Like at any given moment, I can pivot and say, oh, that makes so much sense in the other direction. And yet my attitude about things seems to be encompassed in the meme that's circulating, right? This, like, I would almost call it like this toxic sarcasm. And so I just wanted to throw a broad question out there. How do you see this kind of meme curation actually affecting us as caregivers?
That question makes me think of what happens for young moms on social media. You know, even with parental leave, even with heterosexual households where dad is as active a caregiver as mom, there's still a cultural expectation of what mothering needs to look like and should look like. And when you're a young mother, it's chaos. There's just no way around it. I think that's true if you're a young father. But when you're a mother, and I should say a mother of young children, because I think this is specific about parenting young children from infancy through early school year. And so it's chaos, and you're eating off plates. You're not eating your own meal, and you have that reality. And then you also have some cultural expectations on top of that as to, how giving and nurturing and accepting of that chaos you should be. And then we have the memes, so we have memes that show that chaos, and we have memes that show, the glass of wine at the end of the day. Mm-hmm. And then that gets translated into T-shirts. And I saw bags this weekend with like something, and then wine. It was like, related to parenting young children. And there's, not, and this is true is particularly of millennial age cohort mothers, but there's a real pushback culturally of that messaging. But it has an impact, right? I mean, it's whether the wine industry planned to normalize wine consumption so much that, moms at 2:00 in the afternoon have it in their coffee mug. Like, I don't know if that was their goal, but they were effective. And the fact that we have this cultural expectation of total nurturance and, surrender in the face of that chaos, rather than, oh, that's not sustainable for anyone. And actually, here's your neighborhood drop-in, care center. And this is normal. And this is how we support young families in our nation, right? That's not us. But instead, we'll look the other way if you have wine at 2 p.m. And right. We'll look the other way when you make these jokes about what can be really problematic and toxic drinking. And so I don't mean to put this all on moms, but those are memes that are, you don't have to troll any dark corners of the internet to see that, right? You're going to open up your social media platform and you'll probably, if you're socially connected to, parents of young children, you're definitely going to see some of that content. And I think it just, on one hand, that kind of content normalizes the isolation and the negative feelings that can come from constantly surrendering to that chaos and feeling as though your day just isn't yours to predict because of the needs of these little humans that you have to respond to. And I think that's good. I think we should be able to kind of see the emperor is naked sometimes and recognize, like, what, this is effed up that I, didn't get lunch and I'm eating, half a chicken nugget. But the other side of that is the message of like, yep, that's totally messed up. But here is the you have permission to escape. This is the resource we will give you access to in droves, and we'll give you all sorts of cute products as well, so that you can make light of, these choices that you're making. So I think that's, one example of how memes can set culture and then spread culture. And that can be challenging, can be problematic. And I don't think anyone, becomes a problem drinker because they saw some funny cartoons and shared it a few times, but it creates an environment where everything is permissible, right? Whatever that topic of that meme is. And that's the problem with memes that perpetuate hate or perpetuate negative stereotypes or even positive stereotypes, which are stereotypes and can contribute to hateful rhetoric. The challenge is that those multiple presentations of that idea normalize that idea.
Right. And that's what I kept thinking. I'm like, all right, so if I see wine glasses on a hand towel the moment I walk into Target that say it's nap time somewhere, the normalization, like it makes me wonder, are we in control of what we share? I'm not even sure I'm in control of how I feel about what was shared based on that normalization.
And this is a wine-shaped vessel, but it keeps my coffee hot. And I just want to reassure you, this is coffee.
All right. But I want to kind of follow up on that because you also write that your relationship to meme culture and, social media in general changed dramatically after the deaths of Trayvon Martin and then Tamir Rice and Michael Brown.
Yeah.
Can you speak a little bit about that?
I talk in the book about the fact that our household is multiracial. And my background is white and Dominican. My mom was white. My father's Dominican. I identify as Afro-Latina, and I recognized I was cut off from my Dominican community well until my early adolescence. So I didn't really have access to my father's heritage or my family. My husband is Jamaican and St. Lucian, and we have children of a variety of complexions, including a nephew that we're guardians for who is white. And so we have a variety of culture and racial influences that we bring with us as parents, and then that we've co-created as a family. And, when Trayvon was killed and Zimmerman was acquitted, my oldest children would have been maybe 6. Tamir Rice, happened that same year, 2012, 12-year-old boy whose little baby face looked a lot like one of my children's little baby faces. And it was, those years, I knew that I was a mom of Black children, and yet those years made that mean something that I, as a child raised in a white household from my early years, I had no appreciation of, right? Even though I do diversity and equity work, and even at that point, I had been doing that work, I didn't appreciate fully how that would mean something different for my children and for my experience as a mother. And so it was really seeing and being connected to other Black moms online, because I live in New Hampshire, and until very recently, I didn't really have Black moms in my circle, and I didn't really have Black moms of boys in my circle. That's less true now. But a decade ago, that was very much the case. And it was a stark contrast for me, the kinds of news I was reviewing, the kinds of things that I was sharing, and the kinds of things that the white women that I was friends with or worked with or had gone to school with were sharing. I won't suggest that white mothers in my circle didn't care about these boys and the experiences that they were having. They did. But, it was the care and concern of a headline, and then it would ease. and not the care and concern of everyday life, and not necessarily with the same exposure that I was having of, yeah, these are the boys whose names are headlines, but every day in my feed, more than one mother is sharing some injustice, some effort to, get a care package to a son who's incarcerated, or grieving the memorial of a child who died. And I wasn't seeing that in my white mom social media groups, right? White moms lose their children all the time as well. I would not suggest that grief belongs to only one group, but this kind of state sanctioned violence was not something that I was seeing again and again and again in my social media groups with mostly white mothers. So for me, just allowing myself to be a part of the community that I was a part of, that perhaps in my physical life, because I live in New Hampshire, which has lower racial diversity and kind of more class distance, that combination meant that I was, pretty racially isolated and have been for my entire life. But I think that, a decade ago, that became really obvious. And my kind of sitting with that recognition made it really important to me to not ignore those realities and to recognize, like, I had choices. I could have not followed those pages or friended certain women that I became friends with online. And then I wouldn't have been exposed to the reality that was their existence. And that's, something that racial privilege allows for, right? If we don't want to tune into something, we don't need to.
But as a parent too, then my instinct is continually to almost try to over prepare the children in my life based on the experience I'm having. And later in your book, and I love this part because I think I'm going through this right now, which is, and I'll always be going through this with my kids. I'm in that moment where the parent is shifting from the center to the periphery. And it's hurtful because I was at the center once. But then if that's the case, and based on everything we're talking about right now, if I'm moving to the side, so are my values and principles. And the hope is that they have absorbed what I'm trying to, project.
And I have always been very honest with you that this is not an advice book. So I don't know that we are handling that. But I think your values come through.
Yes. Well, Dr. Brady, it, as always, is a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast. And I really look forward to seeing your book out in stores.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
And I cannot wait to get home to tell my wife we are lowering the bar this holiday season.
Yeah, I hope she embraces it with you.
To learn more about Technology Touchpoints, parenting in a digital dystopia, or to order yourself a copy, go to any online reseller like Amazon.com and be sure to leave a review at goodreads.com. That's goodreads.com. Many thanks to the Samuel P. Hunt Foundation for sponsoring this podcast. Established in 1951, Samuel P. Hunt Foundation is a Manchester-based, independent nonprofit that provides grants primarily for the arts, children and youth services, faith-based organizations, educational institutions, healthcare, and human services. This podcast was brought to you by Nixon Peabody, who delivers exceptional legal services for clients in the community by combining high performance, an entrepreneurial spirit, deep engagement, and an unwavering commitment to a culture of collaboration, diversity, and humanity. Nixon Peabody works with universities, hospitals, and nonprofits of every size to maximize impact. For more information, visit nixonpeabody.com. New Hampshire Family Now is listed on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Amazon Music, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, and more. Listen wherever you get your podcasts or ask your smart speaker to play New Hampshire Family Now.